Yorkshire is well known as being one of the most beautiful places in England. Between its wild beaches, sweeping moorland, and the majestic Pennines, it's easy to see why it's nicknamed God's own country. It's also a place with a rich and varied history, having been built up from its ancient Celtic roots during the Roman occupation of Britain, and then going on to play an important role in the Wars of the Roses, which would come to define England's future, to give just two examples. Honestly, you could do an entire podcast series just on the history of Yorkshire, and someone probably already has. But today, we're going back to a time when this part of the country would be completely unrecognisable to a modern Yorkshireman. Uninhabited by humans, the land was full of swamps and forest, and had the same climate as modern-day Africa. And the differences in the environment were reflected by the animals that lived there. Rather than the badgers, fallow deer and rabbits that roam the moors today, at this time it was home to elephants, cave lions, rhinos and hyenas. I feel like English wildlife has a bit of a reputation for being, well, let's be honest here, a little boring. A lot of the larger, more charismatic species that our neighbours in mainland Europe live alongside were hunted to extinction here centuries ago. But the animals we're talking about now, ones that were even bigger, even more charismatic, were roaming the British Isles even further back. Like, we're talking 130,000 years ago. This was a time known as the last interglacial period, also known as the Ipswichian era. Yeah, I don't know why it's named after some random Suffolk town either. As the name suggests, an interglacial period is the stretch of time between two glacial periods, or ice ages as they're more commonly known. These periods are often very warm. Like I said earlier, the climate in England back then was much hotter than it is now, comparable to modern-day Africa. The Ipswichian interglacial period was the last one, ending about 115,000 years ago, before the most recent ice age began, which was then followed by the Holocene period, which is the one we're living in now. Hundreds of thousands of years. It's the kind of time span that's impossible to wrap our tiny human minds around. And there's a lot we don't know about what the Earth was like back then for obvious reasons. But that doesn't mean that we don't know anything, and a fair bit of that information comes from fossils dating back to that time, and today's episode is about one particular example of that. In order to tell the story of the Armley Hippo, also known as the Leeds Hippo, we need to head back to 1851, when workmen were digging out clay in what was known as a brickfield in Wortley, an area of Leeds near where the Armley Geratery now stands. It began as just a normal work day, until they found something strange in the clay. A huge bone, so big it clearly couldn't have belonged to a human. I don't imagine it was entirely unusual for them to find bones as they dug, but this one stood out to them because of just the sheer scale of it. None of them had ever seen anything like it before, and try as they might, they just couldn't work out what kind of an animal it could have come from. So the workmen did the only thing they could think of, and took the bone down to a small museum on Park Row in Leeds city centre, which was run by the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society. The curator of the museum, Henry Denny, inspected the bones and was able to identify them as belonging to a hippopotamus. More specifically, he would later describe it as being a great northern hippopotamus. And what is a great northern hippopotamus, you may ask? Good question! Shame I don't know the answer! When you look it up, the only stuff that comes up is recountings of the Armley hippo and Denny's identification of it. It doesn't seem to be recognised as a species or subspecies of hippo, extant or extinct. I can't find a single mention of it outside of this specific context. The best guess I can give is that it was like some kind of hypothetical ancient species, kind of like woolly rhinos, mammoths and cave bears. I mean, those examples are a species that did actually exist, but you get what I mean. Maybe they thought that ancient hippos were also a long-lost species and named it that. Although that doesn't necessarily work out either, because Denny originally assumed that the hippo the bones were from had lived after the last ice age, that it was possibly an animal brought over by the Romans, although he would later realise that it was much older than that. Or, I don't know, maybe he just made up the Great Northern Hippopotamus so he could claim he discovered a new species or something. That feels like the kind of thing a Victorian man would do. At some point after this, the hippo remains were later identified as Hippopotamus amphibius, which is actually the exact same species as modern hippos. There are some extinct species of ancient hippo, but seemingly this isn't one of them. The hippos that were roaming the British Isles all those years ago were essentially no different from the ones you see in Africa today. As soon as he realised what he'd been presented with, Denny was eager to see what else might be lying around in the field waiting to be discovered. So, after learning of its location, he set up a dig. Some of the smaller, more delicate bones had already been destroyed by workmen digging through the clay, but Denny was still able to recover an almost complete hippo skeleton, and some of them were even still articulated, leading Denny to conclude that the hippo had died in the spot where it was found. He actually ended up recovering the remains of 3 different hippos, 2 relatively young adults and 1 elderly one. But when people talk about the Leeds hippo, they're referring to just one, the almost complete skeleton, that's been displayed in museums ever since. I don't know which of the 3 it was, or why the other 2 have been more or less forgotten, but my guess would be that maybe the others were only partial remains, and so considered less interesting. Because while it's not all that uncommon for the remains of ancient hippos to be found in the UK, at least it's not uncommon in paleozoological terms, they are usually just fragments. It's incredibly rare to find a skeleton as complete as the Armley hippo. It was also found further north than any other hippo remains in the UK. As well as the 3 hippos, Denny and his team also found the remains of a woolly mammoth, an aurochs, and a horse. Most sources don't mention the horse at all, which leads me to suspect that it was probably determined to be too modern to be interesting. Horses have been such an integral part of British life throughout the centuries that I'm honestly surprised they don't get dug up more often. The mammoth he found is often referred to as an elephant, because at this time mammoths were believed to be a species in the same genus as the Asian elephant. Although mammoths are indeed in the Elephantidae family, these days they're categorised as being a completely separate genus from elephants. And the aurochs is, well, it's an aurochs, the species from which domestic cattle were originally bred from. They're actually one of my favourite historical species, and they were around until relatively recently, with the last known individual passing away in Poland in the early 17th century. Although it's worth noting that they went extinct much earlier here in the UK, at least 3,000 years ago. The remains of the hippos, and presumably the other animals too, were taken back to the Leeds Philosophical and Literary Society's museum, where they were displayed on a table. The museum was forced to close during the Second World War after it was badly damaged in the Blitz. It didn't reopen for over 60 years, until finally in 2008 it was moved to a new location, and once again its exhibits went on display, including the Armley hippo. Since its discovery, there had been a lot of discussion around how old the hippo's remains actually were, and by 1975, technology had finally come far enough that they could solve that question once and for all. One of the hippo's femurs was sent to Scotland for state-of-the-art radiocarbon testing, and the results were a little strange. According to the testing, the hippo had lived about halfway through the last ice age, but that was impossible. The glaciers didn't actually reach as far north as Leeds, but even so, the land was tundra, far too cold for hippos. Scientists were left scratching their heads until one of them learnt that in the mid-19th century, when the skeleton was first found, bones would commonly be coated with gelatine to preserve them, and since gelatin is a carbon-based substance, it was entirely possible that it had contaminated the sample and caused the results to be inaccurate. And this presented a new problem, as every single one of the bones had been coated, so how were they supposed to find an uncontaminated sample to test with? They figured that their best chance would be to use one of the teeth, taking a sample right from the centre of a molar, and just hoping that that would be deep enough to be saved from contamination. And it turned out it was. Although the results were still a little unspecific, as they came back saying that the bones were older than radiocarbon testing could detect. But this, combined with what they already knew, was enough for the experts to say with certainty that the hippo had lived during the Ipswichian period, so between 130,000 and 117,000 years ago. While the story of the Armley hippo has always been a little niche, he's still something of a local celebrity. A heritage plaque on the pavement of Town Street in Armley commemorates the skeleton's finding, although it lists the year as 1852 rather than 1851. To this day, the Armley hippo remains in pride of place in the Life on Earth gallery at Leeds City Museum. In 2017, the museum held a week-long celebration of the Leeds hippo over the school Easter holidays, with various hippo-themed events for children to get involved with. The star attraction was the 2 competitions held for children between the ages of 5 and 12. One was to write a 300-word story about the hippo's life and an adventure he went on, while the other was to do a drawing of the hippo with his animal friends. All of the entries were put on display in the museum for Hippo Week, but the 2 winners had their works adapted into a short animation, using the plot of the winning story and the character designs from the winning illustration. As well as the cartoon, which could be viewed at the museum, other Hippo Week activities included hippo-themed craft workshops and a CSI-style event where children would investigate an animal crime scene. The Life on Earth Gallery briefly closed for refurbishment before opening its doors again in 2022. Like all council-run museums, admissions to the Leeds City Museum is completely free, so if you're ever in the area, why not pop in and pay your new favourite hippo a visit? I certainly will be next time I'm up north. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Animal Nerd podcast. If you enjoyed it, then it would mean the world to me if you could support the show in any way that you can, whether that's through leaving us a review or rating in your podcast player, sharing the show with a friend, liking the video and leaving a comment if you're listening via YouTube, and of course subscribing on your platform of choice so that you never miss an episode. Any and all money made through this podcast goes directly to the Little Rescue Zoo, which is an animal sanctuary specialising in the rescue and rehabilitation of exotic pets and animals with disabilities, and the support you give this show really does make a difference in the lives of those animals. A list of all the sources used for this episode can be found in the show notes, as can our various links, website, email address, that kind of stuff. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay wild, friends!